Hello, everybody. And following the interview with former Minister Tzipi Livni, we want to continue the discussion about the Israelis and the Palestinians. And with this panel, we're going to try and solve in less than a quick hour the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Piece of cake, right? We can do this. So with me here are Amir Fakhouri, who is the director of the research center at Neve Shalom Wachat El Salam, advisor to Joint Society projects in Israel, and Gilad Sher, who is a former senior Israeli peace negotiator and chief of staff to former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, and currently a fellow at the Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. And we also have, of course, Micha Goodman, who is a writer and researcher of Jewish thought, author of the best-selling book on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Catch 67. So we're going to start with you, Amir. If you could maybe, as much as you can, in approximately 10 minutes, explain to us your original solution to the conflict.
First of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here with my revered colleagues and panelists here. It's not my solution. I'm here on behalf of the Political Initiative to States One Homeland, which basically advocate confederation both as a political structure and a political sentiment. And I will further elaborate on that. So basically, we advocate two states with an open borders, and it is good to remind all of us that the original partition plan was imagined as a confederation, as Jerusalem as a joined shared city, as Palestine, the state of Palestine, the state of Israel, as one monetary unit. So we advocated two independent states with an open borders, two sovereign states, two nation states. And that coming together in a shared institution to manage, which is inherently shared interest and shared national resources, material resources like aquifers and such, and we think that this structure, I guess, which reminds us of in some way the EU, can help us to find a way out of the deadlock, especially which is confined in the refugees issues and the settlements. We see the settlements as a political structure that should be treated politically, and Israeli settlers which are willing to succumb to the sovereignty of the young Palestinian state should be there, of course, in a framework of decolonization of the settlements that become, and the Israelis which there will become residents of the Palestinian state and nationals of the Israeli state, and vice versa in what concerns Palestinians refugees, and by no means I'm doing here a symmetry, which want to exercise the right of return. They will become, if they choose to, residents of Israel and nationals of the Palestinian state. So we think that structurally saying, politically and structurally wise, we think that this holistic look to the state as to the homeland, to this geopolitical unit, Israel-Palestine, can give us more spectrum of maneuver to give creative ideas. And I want to emphasize that it is based upon not only rational political structural ideas, but upon a narrative which says we have here two nations living in a close vicinity that should understand and should be educated
that they cannot entertain the idea that they will live here without saying without seeing the other nation. We should educate the young Palestinian boy and the young Israeli Jewish girl that they're here together in a shared homeland, whether they like it or not. And stemming from this existential understanding, we can build and maintain political structure and not otherwise. So this is what the two nations should be taught, that they live here with another nation, and they should try to develop their political imagination, how to share and not how to separate. There's Palestinians already. Fifth of the population of Israel is Palestinians, is Arab Palestinians. So, and I'm not going to go into the dangers of cultivating this this political imagination of separation. All of the modern world went to power sharing models to find a way out of intractable conflict. We Palestinians and Israeli Jews can find a way which stems from the sharing narrative, not the separation. And I will finish with this point. All of what I said already is already anchored in the political reality nowadays in Palestine and Israel, even under terms of Jewish superiority. We have cooperation in terms of security, in terms of aquifers, in terms of open. We have 200,000 Palestinians from the West Bank coming into Israel on a daily basis. So what we're asking, it is a natural thing. It's already anchored, and it need to perfect it. It need to be democratized.
Thank you, Amir. So, Gilad, a confederation, settlers staying in Palestine, joint institutions for a two-stater, that must all sound like a fantasy, right?
It sounds good. I mean, I'm not ruling out anything that Amir mentioned here, but I believe that first we have to deal with the core issues that are the contentious issues between Israel and the Palestinians. Then maybe later, once we have a partition of the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea into two nation states, then we can proceed towards any kind of structure that looks like confederation or other structures that were mentioned in the public debate about that. I believe that, looking at the objectives of the national security of Israel and the long-term objectives of Israel, I believe that the only way to secure Israel as the democratic nation state of the Jewish people is by separating itself from of the Palestinians, and for the Palestinians to have their statehood with self-determination in a state of their own. It's the only way to have a border between the two nation states. Now we are 14 million people, Israelis and Palestinians. That's all between on this piece of land, and we have to first divorce. Then we might engage in a different path. I believe that when I was at the Institute for National Security Studies, we used to once a year look at all the structures and all the initiatives and all the plans that were on the table at that point in time, analyze them according to a certain set of parameters, and year after year after year, the two-state solution got by far the best rating in this research. Now, why is that? look, there's the status quo.
Both Israelis and Palestinians, by the way?
Yes.
Those surveys?
Yes, but of course, I mean, I'm talking as an Israeli Jew, and I'm looking at at the Declaration of Independence of 1948 as my more or less my Bill of Rights, my Constitution, that's what I'm looking for, you know, the kind of universal values, with the Israel being the nation state of the Jewish people, and all together combined in a set of semi-constitutional set of values. So I look at the status quo, or even at management of the conflict, which is often mentioned as the way to proceed. You know, you don't have to take any decision. You don't have to demonstrate any kind of leadership. You just manage the conflict. But the truth of the matter is that there's no such thing as managing a conflict. The conflicts usually manages the conflict manages the parties that are in dispute, and we see it throughout history, and even during these very days. So this will probably not be, you know, the two-state solution is probably only a vehicle to lead towards a better future for Israelis and Palestinians. But and it doesn't have to be a one-off, standalone, you know, permanent status agreement according to certain parameters, be it the Clinton parameters or the Annapolis ones. You know, very few rounds of real negotiations on permanent status that we had in the last 3 decades. Perhaps 10% of the time we were negotiating permanent status. But along the parameters, more or less, I would suggest addressing this as an attempt to change the trend that is currently leading towards a disastrous one-state solution, binational state. This is disastrous for Israelis and for Palestinians alike. So reverse the trend towards a gradual advancement towards a two-state reality and preserving the conditions that would allow a two-state solution to come up at a certain point in time without negating the final agreement that might be attained. So first, it should be a gradual process. Second, it should be a three-pronged approach process. Regional, you know, we can capitalize on whatever happens in the region, and with our allies and the two countries that have long ago signed agreements of peace with us, Egypt and Jordan, and other developments of the last year or two with the Abraham Accords, etc. So capitalize on that. Then bilateral negotiations. We need to discuss whatever happens, and we need an international. I wouldn't say supervisor, but at least a kindergarten kind of body, perhaps the quartet, perhaps others, you know, that would lock us in a room and allow us to discuss whatever divergences we have, and we do have a lot of divergences, including within our internal domestic constituencies, each one of us. But at least whatever is agreed or mutually coordinated would be implemented. And then, little by little, you build layer over layer of, you pave the way towards an ultimate possible two-state solution. Then you can do whatever you want. You can confederate, you can whatever, okay? So I believe that this is it's always not the time for this kind of major decisions. But if you do it gradually, then these are not so major decisions that you have to that have to be taken. So I'm also looking for ways to change the mindsets of the people of this region towards making peace. You know, we plan a lot of clashes, wars, all kind of violent, different degrees of violence and violent conflict between us, and so we plan it. And there's military planning. There's let's plan peace. Let's plan peace once and for all.
Thank you, Gilad. And Micha, working on your book, you must have, spoken to many people, hearing these approaches two-state solution and the, newest confederation idea, but you came to a different conclusion.
That's right. That's right. My conclusion is called shrinking the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Maybe dramatically shrinking the conflict, but assuming conflict is here to stay. And to understand this paradigm of shrinking the conflict, I think there's two main things we have to understand. One, what's a paradigm shift? And two, how do we tap into the invisible Israeli consensus? I'll move from the first to the second, okay? So what's the paradigm shift? I really enjoyed listening to Amir and to Gilad, and they presented what Gilad called what's the ultimate end game? How does it end? What's the solution to the conflict? So there's a basic assumption here that the Holy Grail is end to conflict. Gilad also mentioned the alternative. The alternative is managing the conflict. Now, if ending the conflict is a transformation of the status quo, managing the conflict is freezing the status quo. Now, here's my question. Are those the two options we have? Is that true? I just want to notice that we don't think that way about any problem we deal with in life. Take COVID, for example. Yes, I think New Zealand and Australia had this fantasy of no COVID, zero COVID, to put an end to COVID. And I think they failed. I think they failed. Most countries said, we can't put an end to COVID. But when they realized that we can't put an end to COVID, did they start ignoring COVID? Neglecting COVID? Most countries are trying to figure out a strategy to shrink COVID. When it comes to car accidents, no one is saying let's put an end to car accidents, and the alternative to putting an end to car accidents is not ignoring car accidents. Crime, no one says let's put an end to crime, and no one says let's ignore crime. When it comes to real problems, we don't try to end them, we don't ignore them. We try to shrink them. That's what we think about most problems, and then there's a conflict. And either we're messianic or indifferent. End it or ignore it. Manage it. Freeze it. Let's think about the conflict like we think about COVID, car accidents, and crime. Let's stop ending it. Let's stop managing it. Those are not the only options. It's a false dichotomy, the illusion there's only two options. If we think about this problem like we think about any problem in the world, we'll come to a conclusion that we have to shrink it. But what does it mean to shrink it? What does it mean to shrink the size of the conflict? To explain this and why I think shrinking the conflict is possible, because I think it's an approach that taps in to what most people don't know, that most Israelis agree. Not all Israelis agree. But there is an invisible, Israel is so polarized and divided and angry at each other that polarization is hiding, it's masking an invisible Israeli agreement. And it's a paradoxical agreement. Here's how it goes. Most Israelis do not want to control the lives of Palestinians. The fact that in the West Bank there's a military regime controlling a civilian population in different levels is something that not all Israelis, but most Israelis don't like that. They feel like it's unethical, not Jewish, not Zionistic, and it's a threat. It's a threat to the future of Israel as a Jewish state, Jewish democracy, like Gilad said. At the same time, and probably with more passion and more emphasis, most Israelis are afraid. They're afraid that a withdrawal would put Israel under serious threat. So here's what most Israelis agree on. They don't want to control the Palestinians. They're afraid of any move that would put them under threat of Palestinians. It's a problem. I would say a great visualization of this paradoxical agreement of most Israelis is horrible May. I think we can all agree this last May was a very low moment in the history of Israel. And we saw two things in May. One, rockets on Tel Aviv. Two, Lod, civil war in Lod. So some people,
and Akko and
Akko and Jaffa and Ramle.
To remind us,
that's right. I know, that's true. I'm saying they'll just have a powerful image, but yeah, it was all over the place. And then when we saw Lod, so many Israelis say, wow, if we stay if a binational city doesn't work, will a binational state work? People looking at Lod and saw if Israel stays in the West Bank, eventually Israel turns into Lod. Israel is a binational state. We don't want that. At the same time, Israelis looking at Tel Aviv. And they're saying, well, Tel Aviv, for 1 week, has the feel and taste of what it means to be a resident of Sderot, very close to Gaza, all year. So Israelis were saying, if we leave the West Bank, Tel Aviv will be Sderot. If we stay in the West Bank, Israel will be Lod. These are two catastrophes that most Israelis want to avoid. Again, Israelis don't want to control the lives of Palestinians, and yet they're afraid of a withdrawal that will put them under the threat of a failed state in the West Bank. And there is good reasons to believe that a Palestinian state will be a failed state. Look at Gaza, look at other presidents. So how do you tap in? How do you turn this paradoxical, invisible Israeli consensus? How do you do that? Well, there's no real alchemy here, but here's shrinking the conflict is the following. These are steps on the ground, maybe unilateral, maybe based on local agreements that dramatically shrink the amount that Israelis control the lives of Palestinians without decreasing the amount of security that Israelis enjoy. To control the Palestinians a lot less without being threatened from them more. What does it look like? Am I out of time?
No, it's okay.
Okay, what does it really look like? These are steps right now. The lived reality in the West Bank is like this. There's over 160 Palestinian autonomous islands that are not connected to each other. Every island has an autonomy, but they're not connected to each other because in between is Area C. Area C is area controlled by the IDF, by the Israeli Defense Forces.
60%.
What?
60%.
60% of the land, that's right.
Yep.
So that means that the amount of self-governance of the Palestinian Authority is extremely low. Mm-hmm. There's another problem, by the way, that there's over 160 autonomous islands. They're not connected. They have no way to go abroad in a sovereign way. They're in an airport or a port in the ocean, in the sea. A second problem is that they can't really do their own planning and zoning. There's just not enough land around their villages and towns. A third problem is because of the Paris Protocol, I won't go into a lot of details, but the Palestinian economy is not an independent economy. It's very much dependent on Israel. Let's take care of all
those. Because Israel is occupying.
Yes. So here's a question. I think Israel, without an ultimate solution, could solve all three problems, which means, roughly, connecting Palestinian autonomous islands to each other, connecting them to the world, expanding towns and cities so they could have planning and zoning, and liberating their economy.
Okay,
now,
so without,
let me tell you something.
Let me just end here. Just 1 minute. Let me just conclude.
On this point, okay.
After the Palestinians are connected to each other, connected to the world, and independent economically, the conflict doesn't end. It doesn't end. Okay. All that happens is the following. They have more self-governance, and Israel doesn't have less security. That is shrinking the conflict, and here's the thing. Let's do that tomorrow morning. Let's not wait for the conditions for peace. Let's do that tomorrow morning.
Okay, so that's on shrinking the conflicts. Gilad,
I wanted to,
conflict.
The two core issues that were never a major problem are territory and security. Those are the one that Micha tackles. Okay, so in the negotiations on permanent status, okay, territory, borders, settlements, security arrangements, demilitarization of Palestine, etc., were never the sticking points of the negotiations. And I believe that when you have a picture, that demonstrates the end game, does not negate what you suggest.
Because you were talking about a gradual process, and you're talking about a gradual process without calling the end.
But you have to resolve the conflict, and eventually you will have to resolve it.
Just a second. I want for a second ask Amir, because I saw you were moving inconveniently in your chair during Zmicha's presentation.
You interpreted me correctly.
And I wanted to ask you, first of all, my feeling was that I think both gentlemen were talking very much from an Israeli point of view, and they said so, which, the conflict, of course, has another side. And the other thing thing is, I think in Micha's presentation, we heard a lot about steps that are necessary from your point of view on the ground, but not a lot about what you mentioned, which is nationality and the narrative and, you know, the psychology of the conflict, which does involve an end game.
That's right.
First of all, narratives are not only psychological; they're anchored in the national sentiments of both sides. But you, again, you were correct. I was moving inconveniently because I'm afraid that the eloquent presentation of my friend here is based upon very problematic premises, and I will explain. First and foremost, my friend here, and I'm afraid so, is utterly neglecting the international law. Does international law allow Israel as an occupying force to shrink occupation? There is no shrinking occupation. It's a matter of human rights. And the second premise, I'm not sure if this eloquent equation include Palestinian will. Did you ever ask Palestinian representatives, do you agree to shrinking occupation? I'm guessing he will tell you, do not shrink occupation, just get out of my land, according to international law, the same international law that you derive legitimacy into your state. So you can't conduct a conversation about the Palestinians' situation while regarding Palestinians. And to this extent, you can't conduct a conversation on this conflict from only internal Israeli perspective. And this is what enables that. This is the power stances. What enables such interpretation, and I'm fully sure that it comes from good intentions, that Micha and my Jewish Israeli co-citizens feel enough indulged with power to entertain a conversation about Palestinians' destiny without Palestinians in this political imagination. Palestinians, the vast majority of them, do not want you to shrink. They want, as any nation, they want sovereignty. Okay, it will be in a progressive, incremental way. I think it is a legitimate methodological way of thinking. But first and foremost, any solution should be anchored not only in a political, in a real politique way. It should be anchored in international law. And your equation lacks any reference to international law, and it should be anchored only in the. It should be addressed the grievousness of the occupied people.
Okay, Micha, you'll get an opportunity definitely to answer that. But first, Gilad, because I think you will probably also...
Yeah, I'd like to make three very brief points. The first one is that this kind of shrinking the conflict and managing it, this kind of approach, I'm concerned that some of the trends that are currently worrying us would be irreversible by not moving towards something that is more than just managing or shrinking or handling the conflict.
But again, because you're talking about the gradual process, he's talking about the gradual process. Right. So the difference is that you point at the end game, which is two states, and you think that is important in the gradual process. Why is that? Because
I would like to
need a vision of the end?
I need the vision of the end of two nation states with a borderline between them, with a sufficient I would say, resolution of, and satisfactory resolution of the core contentious issues, Jerusalem, the holy sites, the old city, refugees, the settlements, borders, territory, and security arrangements. All these should be resolved at a certain point in time. You cannot, and because at a certain point in time, if we do not move towards that objective, then some of the trends might be reversible. The second point is the paradox about security, that the fear is, or the concern is that once there is a Palestinian state, then Israel would be threatened by it. And I happen to be the chairman of the executive board of Sapir Academic College, situated 2 miles from the border of Gaza. And I'm telling you that that across the Gaza envelope, villages, towns, and cities, there is a vast majority for an agreement with the Palestinians, not for continuing the status quo, not for continuing to manage the conflict. Number 3, independent steps are needed. Independent steps that are in line with an eventual 2-state solution that contribute to either the negotiations or to the situation on the ground, such as, for instance, differentiating between those settlements that will be part and parcel of Israel once the borderline the boundaries are delineated. That's about 75 to 80% of the settlers that are living adjacent.
Okay, so that's an interesting point, because you're saying without the end goal, then which gradual steps are we actually taking? So, Micha, there are 2 claims here. So the first, Amir is saying you're not even taking into consideration the Palestinian will in this story. And Gilad also says, it's very important what is your end goal, because that, in the end describes also the steps that you're taking towards it.
Okay. Is that our time? You have 6 minutes?
Yes.
Okay. And I probably have less time than that, right?
And of course, the reference to
so I'll try to respond very briefly, very quickly. And obviously, I won't be able to respond to everything you said. Yes, of course. Any solution needs to be anchored in international law. What I'm offering is not a solution. It's not a solution. But it's a way to break the status quo, to break the frozen reality, and to move forward and to reduce suffering. I want to notice something. Over 20 years, the situation in the West Bank has been frozen. By the way, the fact that politically it's frozen doesn't mean that the trends on the ground are frozen. A lot of suffering
is frozen for Palestinians that suffer
right.
every day.
Exactly.
Expropriation, suffer. It's not frozen.
Exactly. Only politically it's frozen. Now here's the big question. Why has it been frozen? Why was there no initiative for more than 20 years? Well, here's why. If any step is measured by the question, will this end the conflict? Well, if it doesn't end the conflict, we're not doing it. If it doesn't lead to complete independence, to complete resolution of the conflict, so the step is off the table. So here, there is a concern that I agree with, that the settlement movement its ideology is freezing the status quo. I think also the peace ideology is freezing the status quo also. I'll try to explain why. Because if any step on the ground, like connecting autonomous islands to each other, connecting them to the world, changing reality on the ground, if any step depends on a peace agreement, I'm afraid that peace agreement that's not coming means no steps on the ground. So if any step depends on peace...
No, it's the other way around.
Peace, let me just finish here, yes? Peace that's not coming means no steps on the ground, so the myth of peace is freezing the status quo, just like the myth of settlements. So shrinking the... Now, towards your question about endgame, is it true that a withdrawal from the West Bank risks Israeli security? Does it risk Israeli security? It's an academic, and it's an important question. I just want to notice, most Israelis think that it does risk Israeli security, and that is why endgame rhetoric doesn't tap in to the broad Israeli consensus, and without the broad Israeli consensus, it's very hard to make progress and to move forward. Here's the thing. I want to speak one last thing about endgame, okay? Once Israel takes initiative with Palestinians, with local agreements, with Palestinians, and by the way, the Palestinians have to make a decision, yes? Israel was formed by the sum of small steps. David Ben-Gurion started building Israel from the bottom up.
Okay, we definitely do not have time for the history of Israel.
Increasing self-governance until it was a state. Yes. I'm not saying Palestinians need to support Zionism, not at all. I'm saying Palestinians need to be like Zionism. It's a very successful movement, being like Zionism, building their sovereignty bottom up, shrinking the conflict enables exactly that. And finally, once Israel connects the autonomous islands to each other, connects them to the world, liberates their economy, we can speak about a real autonomy here. Not a state, but it's what Israeli general Giora Eiden calls critical mass of self-governance. Once you have that, well, it fits into many endgames. One endgame, two-state. Second endgame, confederation. Third endgame, confederation with Jordan. Fourth endgame, Begin's autonomy. It fits into multiple endgames. Right now, we thought we have to agree on the endgame to play the game. I'm saying let's not agree on the endgame, only agree on the game, and then we can move forward.
Maybe you should have called it unfreeze the status quo instead of shrinking the conflict, which is causing maybe the conflict. No?
Well,
whatever. Okay, ending remarks, Gilad and Amir.
So I say that there's not much difference between what we all speak about, and the question is, how do you go about that? How do you start moving towards any direction when you're not negotiating, there's no process of any kind of dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians for quite a long time, since 2014, I think, last time that we were any kind of talks.
Well, we had a couple of meetings recently,
yes,
which are not really
but these are photo-op meetings. These are not negotiations. You negotiate every day, day in, day out. My final suggestion is this: when I negotiated, Camp David in Taba, etc., and all the covert negotiations, we always had this paradigm or this formula of nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, which of course blocks the way towards a full-fledged agreement. I believe that we need to change that. And here I agree with Micha. Whatever is agreed or mutually coordinated or independently suggesting a preservation of a two-state solution should be implemented. That changes the mindsets of the people. It is visible on the ground, and it leads towards a better reality. We need to move from reality A of the conflict to reality B of moving towards ending the conflict, even if we do not end it immediately, and there's no feasibility for that right now. So that's my proposal to kind of link the three of us into one way that we could move forward.
So we're not going to end the conflict. That's already, I think, pretty sure. But
Micha doesn't want to end the conflict.
Right, we're not going to shrink or end it. But we are going to end the panel. So
as a final remark, you know what? Theoretically speaking, there is no wrong in thinking about ending conflicts or even managing conflict in an incremental way, gradual way. But again, there is no need for theory here. We're here after 100 years of conflict, and we saw when we say gradual or let us if not or not agree on that, let us proceed. Proceeding is deepening the occupation, deepening the Palestinian suffer. What has not been agreed upon has become even more aggravated. So this theory of graduality should be, of course, anchored in a certain history. And the second and last remark, which is impeding the ending of the apartheid regime and occupation in the West Bank, are not peace initiatives and not the thinking that the Israeli military occupation should end tomorrow. This is not impeding peace.
Regardless of an agreement.
Regardless of it should end according again to international law, and this should be emphasized again and again. What is impeding peace is
the Jewish-Israeli superiority ideology that most of the Israelis, unfortunately, the vast majority of the Israelis indulge, and they indulge a sentiment of superiority because they can, because the power relation enables them. So if we want peace to become, if they want to end Palestinian suffering, we should think how to legitimize the rising of Palestinian power, and we should think in power relation terms, and not only in this. This is another critical paradigm shift that should be embraced.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank you all for coming here, of course, but also for keeping this discussion alive. It's not so trivial these days. So thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Noah.
Thank you.